Hello and welcome everyone. Hope everyone's having a great Wednesday. I am Dr. Corey Linneman. I'm the new president of our Parenting and Families Special Interest Group for ABCT, and we are hosting a webinar by our wonderful speaker today, who is actually our outgoing president, Dr. Heather Risser from Northwestern University. She has two very important roles that she's going to talk to you about today. The first is that she is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine in Chicago. She is also, her second role is she's the mom of two little boys, one of whom has Down syndrome. And her work focuses on designing, implementing, and evaluating innovative service delivery methods to build parent capacity to manage their child's behavioral, mental health, and disability needs, and to access therapeutic services. Her lab partners with parents and community providers to find gaps in service access and service delivery and design intervention strategies to address those gaps by building parent capacity to meet their child's needs, to overcome barriers to treatment, support therapeutic goals at home, and promote self-regulation in children with mental health symptoms and neurodiversity. And her team also provides training and technical assistance to community providers who then provide mental health services to children and families themselves. So welcome, Dr. Risser. We are excited to hear all the things that you have to teach us today about helping kids and families with developmental differences.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I have been admitting people while you were talking, but I'm going to share my screen so I can show the presentation. So you may have people still joining. And then if I could just get confirmation that you can see my slides.
Yes, we can see your adorable slides.
Okay, awesome. So, so our family care parenting lab, CARE stands for Coaching, Advocacy, Resources, and Evaluation. And we're a group of researchers and students and staff too. And we strive to maximize parent and child well-being by identifying specific disparities in care access, as well as developing targeted programs to address parent and child needs. We focus on parents and the community as key stakeholders in children's well-being. The Family Care Lab aims to develop interventions that promote mental health and optimal development. We conduct community-engaged research through the lenses of both public health and developmental psychopathology, and we aim to utilize community-based participatory research methods whenever possible. So you can check out our website. It's a little bit out of date. We need to update it more, but we do have some projects that we're currently working on. So I guess I was expecting a smaller group, so I was thinking we could do quick introductions, but I think with the group this size, we're not going to necessarily have time for that. But thank you all for joining, and I will just move on. So just think about how difficult it is for you yourself to do something hard 15 minutes a day, like how difficult that is to do something really, really hard. Now think about how difficult it would be to do something that same level of hard, but for only 1 minute a day. It seems much more achievable, right? So just kind of hold that in your mind. And then I just want to start out by talking about neuroaffirming versus disability language. So person-centered language is when the person is first and the diagnosis is second. So Jaden has autism, or we might in general talk about a person with a disability. Identity-centered language is when the neurodiverse identity is used as a descriptor for the person. So Jaden is autistic. Different people have different preferences for how others refer to them. And it's often a source of pride for some to use identity-centered language when referring to themselves. So I'm autistic. However, it can be offensive to others. Since I'm the mother of a son with Down syndrome, there isn't really an identity-centered equivalent, so I personally default to person-centered language. So that's what I'll use throughout the presentation, but I do want people to know that I am aware of these differences. Also, I have a website here at the bottom So you will get access to a recording of this slide. This website walks through different, it's sort of like a neuro-affirming language guide that kind of gives you a guide to different kinds of language. So, and you can just type your responses in the chat, but I'm just curious to see what people's definitions are of a developmental delay or a developmental disability. Just gonna see. Oh, I don't know if I can check the chat while I'm sharing. Probably can't.
I can read you the chats.
Okay, yeah, read me a few that people put in there. And if no one's entering, that's fine. I can move on. I know this is a big group.
Here we go.
Okay.
So I had said meeting early milestones later than expected. Someone has said individuals who may be meeting developmental milestones at a slower pace than expected or intended. We have low IQ, being cognitively behind peers of the same age.
Okay, great. Yeah. So we have many terms such as developmental delay, disorder, disability. And while we can probably all agree that some of this language might be outdated in terms of neuroaffirmation, the medical community really lags behind the advocacy community. Thus, we only have established norms for typical development. So a diagnosis and intervention still starts from a deficit model, right? Where are you relative to the norm, the typical development, right? But many of us are actively supporting the development of more diverse norms so that we can support a more global use of neuroaffirming language so that we can say, okay, relative to other people with this diagnosis, where is this child? And so it's less of a deficit model, right? It's sort of recognizing the whole person and so that's sort of where we're going. But currently, developmental delays are considered to be more short-term or the first sign of a longer-term concern, whereas a developmental disability is usually considered a lifelong condition. And so a developmental delay, as like many of you said, when the children's progression through predictable developmental phases is slower than the norm. Again, it's really a deficit model. I do want to acknowledge that. But at this time, we don't have anything else for sort of starting that process to provide intervention. But domains could include motor, cognitive, speech, social, emotional, or all of the above. And common genetic disorders or other causes include Down syndrome, Angelman syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, Rett syndrome, muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, injury, illness, or other disorders. And then the neurodevelopmental disorders categories include intellectual disability, global developmental disability, communication disorders, specific learning disorders, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and mood disorders. So all neurodevelopmental disorders do not come necessarily with an intellectual disability, and I think that's an important reason that we use the word neurodiversity, because it is a pretty diverse group. And the onset of neurodevelopmental disorders occurs in the developmental period. So usually often before the child enters grade school. It's characterized by development of deficits that produce impairments of personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning. And neurodevelopmental disorders frequently co-occur. For example, people with autism spectrum disorder often have intellectual disability, but not always. And people with Down syndrome often have ADHD. And people with ADHD may also have a specific learning disability or disorder. For some disorders, the clinical presentation includes symptoms of excess as well as deficits and delays in achieving expected milestones. For example, people on the autism spectrum may only be diagnosed. Autism the autism spectrum diagnosis is usually only provided when the characteristic deficits of social communication are accompanied by repetitive behaviors, restricted interests, and intense insistence on sameness. Historically, the description of developmental course as delayed or the identification of disorders operated via a deficit model with diagnosis and labels are used as shorthand to limit a person's potential, which contributed to stigma. However, recently people are embracing their diagnosis with pride, broadcasting their strengths and contributions, and identifying opportunities to modify environments so that they excel. This highlights the fact that deficits often occur in the way we have constructed environments that exclude those with disabilities and delays, centering the deficits in the individual rather than in the society we've constructed. So I think that's a really important piece. That said, we can combine neuro-affirming and skill building. So for my son, my goal is to affirm his reality and challenge him to reach his potential. An aspect of neuroaffirmation is recognizing opportunities for kids to feel pride in accomplishing something hard. And in the developmental course, we know that we sort of have this course over time. Hopefully, one day we will not see the green, yellow, red, with the red being delayed or disordered, but rather we will have what are the expected trajectories for different diagnoses and different neurodiversity. However, regardless of what we see in terms of that, we know that the earlier we intervene in this trajectory, the more, the less impact it's going to have on a delay, and more impact it will have on kids reaching their potential. So that the earlier we can intervene, which is why a lot of children with developmental delays get early intervention. The idea is to really help them to start to reach their potential as early as possible. So again, the earlier we intervene, the greater impact over the life course. And so the idea is that small doses add up, right? If you start to get once a week physical therapy, a few months old, you got 3 years of physical therapy in before the child is 3, right? So that's that idea. And so how much intervention? What is the dosage for physical therapy, occupational therapy, feeding, speech and feeding therapy, developmental therapy, behavioral therapy, social skills, or academic skills? It's hard to know. So one of the things that I started very young was this idea, or with my child when he was very young, was this idea of 1% better every day. So if you think about 1% better every day for 1 year, you actually exponentially increase that exposure to either that therapy or that skill. Whereas over time, as the child gets older, if you aren't sort of focusing on that growth goal, you miss out on a lot of that opportunity. So what does 1% better look like every day? So if you sat at the table, so I'm going to use an example of something that was really hard for my little guy. To sit at a table for 1 minute a day and do some type of activity, whether it was holding a pencil or looking at a book, it was really hard for him. And it sounds hard to believe, but think of everything involved in sitting at a table. You have to focus your attention, you have to balance your body, you have to use your core muscles. For a kid who has low muscle tone, it was really, really hard. So what is 1% better for day 2? If you start at 1 minute a day and increase 1% each day for 365 days, you end up at 7 minutes and 5 seconds at the end of the year. And so while that doesn't sound like a lot, if you think about it, it's 7 times better than where he started. And so if you can increase the 1 minute you can increase by 5 seconds a day, you get to 31 minutes and 20 seconds. So the next question might be, but well, what should I work on? So one, it's important to identify your parenting values, identify any safety issues. And this is where the deficit model can be useful, focusing on building capacity in areas of challenge. So for example, are there things that the child needs to accomplish to stay safe? Are there things that the child needs to accomplish to participate in, your daily family life? Are there things that you want the child to work on to increase his or her success at school or in the community? Are there behavioral things challenges that the child has that are interfering with their ability to be included in different environments? So some of identifying the goal really depends on what you, or if you're a provider, what the parent, what's most important to the parent. So then you want to lay the groundwork. So you want to be sure the parent and the provider are on the same page. And so a student of mine and I created the Parent Therapist Partnership Survey, and there's a link down here. It's a free survey, and it basically helps to kind of identify what parents' values are in terms of working with their provider and where they feel they are. So that if you're a provider, you can give this to the parent, and then you can see, oh, wow, so it sounds like it's very important to be told why each therapeutic intervention is being used for the parent. That's very important, but it sounds like they're not really getting that. So I could work as a provider, I could work on being better in this area to increase, because I know it's important for them. So then as a provider, you can look through here. As a parent, you might go through this measure and see where your values are in terms of communicating with your provider, and get a better sense of what you can ask the provider. So you can say, hey, I've realized that I really want to know what each therapeutic why each therapeutic intervention is being used, but I actually don't know that. Would you mind walking me through that? So either the parent or the provider could use this survey to kind of improve communication and get everybody on the same page. That will be a good first step. And then it's important to identify goals. So part of the goals depend on the age of the child. So for little kids, you might want to be working on increasing the child's time on tummy time, introducing new foods, teaching signs if they're doing sign language, working on the crawling pose, hand-eye coordination, serve and return, which is sort of like working on that eye coordination and communication, receptive language, expressive language. And for older children, it might be working on social skills, it might be working on emotion regulation, it might be working on patience, practicing waiting, which is a good sort of fundamental skill that crosses a lot of different contexts and activities. You might be working on a specific physical therapy goal or speech goal or therapy goal. And so the good thing about speech goals are that you can do those at any time. You could do those in the car, you could do those at the grocery store, you could do those during dinner. And then you want to think about your implementation strategies. So how can you then include that 1 minute, those 2 minutes, into other activities, so that you're not sort of feeling by the time you get up to 7 minutes or you get up to 10 minutes, you don't have to find that time in your day, because we all know the more you have to kind of carve out separate time, the harder it is to do. So how can you integrate those 7 minutes or those 10 minutes throughout your day? And if you are working on patience, you do want those 7 minutes to be lumped together. But if you're working on speech, you could do a minute before school, 2 minutes after school, 3 minutes at dinner time, and then 2 minutes before bed, or whatever adds up to 7. So you have more options. You want to think about, and for those of you who have attended other parent and family SIG webinars, and if you haven't, you might want to go back to the one that we did, I think last year, on PCIT. So you want to use labeled praise, you want to use unlabeled praise, find motivators to reinforce the child's behavior, because remember, this is going to be hard for them. So how do you reinforce hard behavior? Using visual schedules so that they know what's next, when this is going to end, so it doesn't feel like this super long time. Use repetition. And then scaffolding skills is where you start with a more basic skill and you help them to master that. Then you go to the next skill, because if you start too hard, that can feel really overwhelming. So for my son, the idea of getting him to sit at the table for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes was really designed so that then he could start working on handwriting, holding a pencil, writing with the pencil. But we couldn't get there until he could actually tolerate sitting at the table, right? And then the use of social stories has been really helpful. How do you use a social story to kind of walk through, in some ways, what you want to happen or what is happening, so that they have a better sense of sort of building that expectation? So I know we do have a big group, but if people want to write in the chat, what has worked for you or your parents to integrate therapy goals into their day?
And while we are giving people a chance to write, there was a request for the link to that neuroaffirming language website.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was talking super fast, so I got through the slides a little faster than I was expecting. So I will go ahead and paste those links in the chat.
Awesome. So I did do the one for your measure about the therapeutic.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
involvement.
So then, okay, sounds good.
So
So
we
I
can
will do
use
the
the
one for the neuroaffirming language.
Yes. And then you had requested for people to type in the chat ways that it's worked in your parenting to, we say it again, to
Ways
incorporate
that
strategies.
into their day. Yeah.
Great. Okay. The link's in there. Thank you. And are you able to see the chat now, Dr. Risser?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay, so Dr. Moen says that she talks about scheduling specific time to practice skills and usually suggests tying it to specific routines to make it predictable and easy to remember. Then we talk about generalizing. That is a great strategy, especially for kids who really like that routine and that predictability. Giovanna says finding things they enjoy, like painting or molding Play-Doh for fine motor. My son is older, 6 years old, so these are huge motivators. That is great. And I think you really want to think about and try a lot of different things, because that for my son was like so overwhelming and hard that he would leave the table, right? Play-Doh. So you really have to find what works for your children. And they do have so many different like fidget type things and sensory motor activities now with Play-Doh and that smart sand and gel stuff and slime. And so there's so many different things that tools that we can use. So it's really helpful to know what works for each kid. And then I will also type in put in the chat my contact information and the link to our lab. If you want to just kind of see what we're doing. Like I said, it's hard to stay up with the website. We have a lot more projects happening right now than our website actually shows, but it takes time and effort to update that. So sometimes it's not always the most updated. But we are a little ahead of schedule, so I'm happy to take any questions or other. So Michelle writes, building learning strategies into daily routines that already have to happen. For example, diaper changes, bath time, laundry, instead of trying to carve out separate time. Exactly. And the benefit to that, so the benefit to the separate time is that it really helps with that routine. However, if you're building it into an existing routine and you do it every time, that can still be there. And then the benefiting of into that routine versus a separate time is that you might be able to build on that generalizability. So rather than taking out and thinking about, okay, this table time occurs at this time of day, you can practice table time at your table time. You can practice, if you have like an island with a little stool, you can practice that balancing, during, breakfast, or you pull a little stool over for them to sit and balance while you're folding laundry, or you have them sit on the piano bench and play the piano, so that you can think about what are other ways you can, integrate this into this skill set, so that it doesn't always feel like it's the same thing for them. Any other questions?
There was one question in the chat that I answered when you were talking, and they just wanted to know how young a child could be to diagnose autism. And I put that depends on the kid, but for some kids, it's as early as that second year of life, like that 12 to 24-month range. But wanted to know if you wanted to add thoughts to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think sometimes kids can get diagnosed as early as 18 months if their symptoms, if they're showing the symptoms are just more salient, and the parent is sort of engaged in the kind of community life in which somebody would notice it. So the kinds of things that delay a diagnosis typically are that that child is not engaged in things like daycare, any kind of services. They may not, they're less likely to have those eyes on them, or, if they're not going to their well child visits. But typically, it would be caught ideally by the age of 2. Or I would say by the age of 3, so that they can engage in early intervention. However, if the signs are more subtle, or they have another condition like Down syndrome, so I know one of my son's peers was just diagnosed with autism, but because she had Down syndrome, she wasn't diagnosed until 5th grade. They're in 5th grade right now, because the Down syndrome, some of the providers didn't recognize that these are, different symptoms. So some of that depends on what that child is, what kinds of care access that child has. But certainly if you're a parent, or if a parent is communicating to you that they have a concern, parents are the experts on their kids. And if they feel like something is delayed or they have a concern, I think we really need to prioritize that parent's perspective and connect them to services that can do diagnosis. I think depending on where they live, the problem is that those diagnoses, those appointments there can be a waiting list. Any other questions? So one of the things that I know when I talk to parents of kids with disabilities, that often is sort of top of their mind are behavioral concerns, like disruptive or unsafe behaviors. And so I think that's sort of like a whole nother presentation, which I'm happy to do at another point. But there are certain skills that they can work on in this same sort of building capacity way, working a couple minutes a day, that can help with regulation. So things like building patience for waiting, building tolerance for situations that are less pleasant for them. So some of those could be, sort of with an underlying anxiety mechanism, or some of those could be a sensory mechanism. And then another thing we can really think about is how do we modify the environment to help them? And when I say modify the environment, we have to be a little bit careful, because if the underlying mechanism is anxiety, we don't want to modify the environment such that they get to avoid that thing every time, because then that actually can contribute to worse anxiety, right? We want them to be able to build up a tolerance to be brave. So if there's something that they're trying to avoid, it's helpful to sort of try to figure out what is it about that situation, about that stimulus that they're trying to avoid, and find ways that you could support them to build a tolerance for that. So for example, a lot of kids, and for some kids it might be hard because it's kind of maybe a mixture of sensory and anxiety. So for example, going to an overwhelming place like a grocery store, helping to better understand, oh, if they are wearing headphones and, we go in for a brief time, can we still kind of expose them to that versus we never take them to a grocery store, in which it makes it harder for them to eventually then return. Okay, so it sounds like at least one person would like to see the behavior presentation. So Corey, maybe we can look at the schedule and see when we could fit that in next, this next in 2025. And since we're so far ahead of schedule, I could, oh yeah, okay, so, okay. So Mariella writes that the child wants to play with other children in the park, but can't answer to questions from other children and gets called names. And so that can be really, really tricky. So that's a little bit hard because it would be helpful to know a little more, like, is it that they don't have speech and then or that it's difficult for them to comprehend I guess it depends on whether it's an expressive language, a receptive language, or sort of a more global communication issue with the questions. But that's certainly something that you could sort of role play and practice at home. If the child uses signs or a communication device, that sounds more like that might be that's a little trickier. That's more of sort of like an educational issue for the other kids, right? Oh, gotcha. Okay, so it's more his articulation. Yeah, that's a little trickier. So in terms of helping with the articulation, that is something that the parents can work on at home, with that sort of building that capacity 1% more each day. So whether that starts with 1 minute, and you would want to work very closely with the child's speech therapist so that they give you the exercises to work on, and then you just work on them each day with the child. For the child who at the park, I'm guessing when the children call the child names, the child gets upset, and so that may actually be a motivator for them to start to think about ways that they can be an advocate for themselves and learn ways to explain to the other children. That might be a high bar if they're still struggling with basic articulation, and so then you may want to focus much more on those individual. It's hard to be more specific without knowing more specifics, but definitely work with the speech therapist, and you can, if the child will tolerate 1 to 2 minutes a day, wherever the child can tolerate, that's where you start. So if they can tolerate 6 minutes a day, 7 minutes a day now, there's no reason to start at 1 minute, right? You can start at 7 and then 7.5, and then you go up. Yes, and Jennifer had a great suggestion that sometimes a more able buddy can help with social situations. But again, I think it depends on where that starting point is for the child. Sorry, I got a direct message. Oh, gotcha. So he doesn't have other children around or siblings. Yeah, that does make it hard. So probably my suggestion for this goal then would be the articulation as much as possible at home. And yeah, that's what we did with my son. He did have a communication device for a short period of time that he carried with him. And that helped with certain things, but not others. So, and then he also had signs for a brief period of time, but a lot of other kids don't learn signs. I wish that we could change the environment faster and that sign language would be a second language taught in all the schools, like an option, like Spanish and French and German or whatever. That would be amazing, but it's not. Oh, great. Jennifer says that Solomon gives detailed information about how to facilitate social development using structured play activities and with more capable peers. Is Solomon a website?
It's called the Play Project. He presented at a conference I went to years ago, and I'm not sure where he is on the web, but he's an MD, and he has something called the Play Project. It's built off of DIR floor time, and he has videos about two different things: parents facilitating this using play in a very structured way, and then group peer and he gives it's very specific. Like what I said was just very general, but he goes all into it, and it's different goals and different ways that you structure it for different types of issues and different ages, and he that's his thing. Hope that's helpful for people.
Yeah, I found it on the web, so I just put that in here.
If
Oh,
you ever have
Corey
a
found
chance
it
to hear
too.
him speak, he is phenomenal.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I think some of it also depends on the type of what the child's sort of working with. So how old are they? What's their age? And then a lot of kids with autism, they don't have the intellectual disability, so that facilitates certain types of skill sets. People with Down syndrome may have additional issues with the low muscle tone, but also the larger tongue. And so even when they're really working on it, the ability to understand what they're saying can be impacted. And so I think there's just a lot of different elements that we're working with. But I think at the end of the day, being able to support the child's practice is going to be an important component. And also, like I said, advocating for us to have more inclusive environments. Any other questions? So this might be a little short PowerPoint for a presentation, and people can have more time back in their day.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Hope you got something out of this, got some good links to further resources. And if you think of anything else, you can contact Dr. Risser at Northwestern University. I will go ahead and post the link to our YouTube channel. We have a parenting and family special interest group YouTube channel that the previous talks have been posted on. And this one, as soon as we get it downloaded, will be posted there as well. So if you know somebody who didn't get a chance to hear the whole thing or you want to go back and listen to parts of it again, that will be available. Hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.